The Didcot Railway Centre is a heritage site in the English county of Oxfordshire. It's built around a restored Great Western Railway engine shed, and, as one might expect, is now home to a large amount of preserved GWR steam locomotives. Like loads of other places that I went to while I was in the UK, I had already known about Didcot for many years, so it was kind of surreal to actually be there in person. There are 3 short demonstration lines on site, and 2 of them were in operation on the day I visited, that being Wednesday the 16th of April. The little 040 saddle tank number 1340 Trojan was running on the branch line, while the vintage diesel railcar number 22 was running on what's known as the main line. After staying in London for a few days, Didcot was the first place we went to, and we got there aboard this Class 800 IET. Not long after paying the admission fee, I came across this impressive lineup of tank engines outside the shed, with 8750 pannier tank number 3738 up front. We'll come back to 3738 and her friends later. The first locomotive we'll take a look at is 3822, an example of the GWR 2884 class. This was a class of 280 tender engines developed from the earlier 2800 class of 1903, with 83 examples built between 1938 and 1942. 3822 was in service from 1940 to 1964, and while she has run under her own power and preservation, she's been on static display since 2010. This locomotive is notable for her appearance in the music video for the Queen song Breakthru. 2 tracks over from 3822, one could find the world-famous 4079 Pendennis Castle. It's a pity that this locomotive wasn't in steam on the day of my visit, but seeing her resting in the shed was better than not seeing her at all. 4079 was built at Swindon in 1924, as one of the earlier members of the 4073 Castle class. She remained in service well into the British Railways era, not being withdrawn until 1964. Her life and preservation has been most unusual, in the sense that she was famously sold to Hammersley Iron and exported to Australia, of all places, in 1977. During her time in the land down under, she was reunited with LNER A3 Pacific number 4472 Flying Scotsman, when the A3 was visiting for Australia's bicentenary. Eventually, Pendennis was repatriated in 2000, and after a long restoration, she returned to service in 2021. At the back of the shed, you could find one of 4079's classmates. This is 5051 Drisclowen Castle, and she is much younger than Pendennis, having been built in 1936. From what I remember seeing in a Laurie's Mechanical Marvels video, 5051 featured in a lineup of castles in 2023, when 5043 Earl of Mount Edgecombe and 7029 Clun Castle came to Didcot. Also at the back of the shed was number 5, Shannon, a dinky little 040 tank built by George England and Company in 1857. She started out on the Sandy and Potton Railway, but spent most of her working life on the Wantage tramway, and is notable for being the only standard gauge George England locomotive in preservation. There were plenty of other noteworthy locomotives in the shed, such as 6023 King Edward II, 6998 Burton Agnes Hall, and 5322. But to prevent this video from getting too long, I'll only discuss one more in detail before we go back to what's outside the shed. This is 5900 Hinderton Hall, an example of the famous 4900 Hall Class 460. The halls were designed by Charles Collett and built between 1928 and 1943, with the design essentially being an updated version of the earlier 2900 Saint class. Thinking back to 5900, she was built at Swindon in 1931, and had a long service life lasting well into the British Railways era. 5900 was withdrawn in 1963 and sent to Barry Scrapyard in South Wales, but later saved by the Great Western Society and brought to Didcot in 1971. Much like some of the locomotives I saw at the Newport Railway Museum in Australia, such as Victorian Railway's H220, there were steps placed alongside 5900, thus allowing visitors to climb up onto the footplate. This was one of only 7 British locomotives whose footplate I was able to visit throughout my trip, and speaking of which, watch this space for my video on the Severn Valley Railway, which will feature footplate shots on 4930 Hagley Hall. Upon returning to the tank engine lineup outside the shed, we find Large Prairie 6106. This locomotive was built at Swindon in 1931 as one of the 6100 class 262 tank engines, a development of the 5101 class of 1929, with the main difference being a higher boiler pressure. 6106 was the only member of her class to survive into preservation, and although she's currently out of service, she was given a cosmetic overhaul in 2019. An unusual point in this engine's preserved life was when she briefly appeared in the 1968 film The Bliss of Mrs. Blossom, for which she was painted in a weird psychedelic livery. Back at the front of the convoy, we have Pannier Tank 3738. She is an example of the 8750 class, which was a slightly modified version of the famous 5700 class of 1929. 3738 was built at Swindon in 1937, and lasted in service for a reasonable 28 years. After almost a decade at Barry Scrapyard, she was saved for preservation and brought to Didcot in 1974. At the other end of the convoy, you could find Small Prairie 5572. She was built at Swindon in 1929, and is now one of 11 examples of Collett's 4575 class in preservation. The 4575s were a development of Churchwood's earlier 4500 class of 1906, with the most notable change being the larger water tanks that sloped at the front. For comparison, here's 4566, whose tanks are noticeably smaller than 5572, and they're not sloped, for that matter. On a personal note, I've had the Small Prairie pack by Victory Works in Train Simulator for many years now, so it was cool to finally see some of these locomotives in real life. And now we finally come to the branch line, where we see 1340 Trojan in steam and pulling, or propelling, auto coach number 190. Trojan was built by the Avonside Engine Company of Bristol in 1897, but originally for use as a dock shunter in Newport, South Wales, and didn't become part of the GWR's fleet until 1923. As an aside, I recognise the name Avonside because that same company built the New Zealand Railway's L-Class 240 tanks, a design for which I have had a soft spot for many years now. Thinking back to Trojan, I recommend reading this locomotive's page on the Didcot Railway Centre's website for more information about her history. Trojan's short run ended at an old transshipment shed, which dates from the days of Brunel's 7 feet and a quarter inch broad gauge. The shed is now home to 2 replica broad gauge locomotives, namely Firefly and Iron Duke. The latter was built in 1985, over 100 years after the withdrawal and scrapping of the original, and has even appeared in a book in the railway series called Thomas and the Great Railway Show. Unfortunately, Iron Duke and Firefly are both out of ticket, so they can't be steamed up, and I doubt they'll be restored anytime soon given just how short their demonstration line is, and there isn't really anywhere else in the country for them to run, as far as I know. The transshipment shed is a short walk away from the northern end of Didcot's main line, so I thought I'd go back towards Didcot Parkway station aboard the diesel railcar. Number 22 was built at Swindon in 1940, and she's one of 3 GWR railcars to have been preserved. Another survivor, number 4, can be found on display at the National Railway Museum in York, although this one is older than number 22, having been built in 1934. To an extent, the GWR railcars remind me of RM31, another vintage diesel railcar with a cab at each end, except this one runs on 3-foot 6-inch gauge and is slightly older than number 22, having been built in 1938. In conclusion, I was very impressed with what I saw at the Didcot Railway Centre, and yet the GWR is still not my favourite of the big 4. Come to think of it, I don't really have a favourite, although I used to think that honour went to the LNER. In any case, out of all the locomotives I saw at Didcot, my favourite has to be 4079 Pendennis Castle. The whole site was one of the best heritage operations I saw while I was in England, and I can easily recommend visiting this place for yourself if you're ever in the area. It helps that it could be done as a short day trip over from London. As a teaser for what will hopefully be the next video, I will leave you with some footage of trains in the village of Haresfield, recorded on the same day as my Didcot visit, plus one clip from the next morning.